June 22, 2009 Observer Newsletter, Misawa Tragic Death. UFC 99 Trump Angle Triplemania, Sylvia. By Observer Staff. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009.1 ISSN 10,839,593. June 22, 2009. Misawa dies tragically in the ring. You could make a great case that the biggest pro wrestling event of all time took place on April 2, 1995, and it obviously wasn't WrestleMania at the Hartford Civic Center. The last survivor of the old line of Japanese weekly wrestling magazines, Weekly Pro Wrestling, was, like pro wrestling in Japan in general, at a popularity peak. The magazine would sell 300,000 copies every week on newsstands on virtually any street corner in any city of any size in the country. The magazine put together a show at the Tokyo Dome. Because its influence in star-making and popularity of wrestling was so strong that only one promotion, WAR, which had bad relations with the magazine, would dare turn down the invitation to appear. At first, many of the 13 different promotions involved in the 13-match show were just going to send some representatives, but it turned into major competition. Once a few companies announced sending their biggest stars and in most cases, matches that were being sent to steal the show, the ante was up. Every company wanted to shine on the biggest stage that most would ever perform before, or at the very least, not look second-rate. There were 54 wrestlers appearing on that show, all but a few of whom were major stars. 15 of them ended up as Hall of Famers. The show drew a sellout of about 50,000 fans and, at the time, the largest live gate in pro wrestling history, hovering in the $5 million range. There have been bigger gates, bigger events and far more publicized shows since that day, but no show in history ever contained that much superstar talent with that kind of variety of matches. On that day, there was little question that the biggest star in pro wrestling was Mitsuharu Misawa. That there were plenty of superstars and superstar reactions on a smorgasbord of types of wrestlers and styles of wrestlers, ranging from the fast-paced heyday of in-ring women's pro wrestling, lucha libre, worked shoot UWFI style women's MMA match, a pancrase style shoot, a science fiction style alien death match for the interplanetary heavyweight title with challengers from other planets, a barbed wire barricade barbed wire baseball bat tornado death match, and an explosive barbed wire match. After Atsushi Onita used a barbed wire baseball bat and took a full swing to the gut of rival King Pogo, Mr. Pogo, knocking him into the exploding barbed wire and blowing him up, and then pinning him, he waited for his usual huge pop from the biggest crowd he had ever performed before. It never came. Instead, the people were salivating over what their program said was next. Misawa. 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 Started a loud chant, which built until the first bar of music played for the entrance one of the All Japan wrestlers. The crowd gave one after another the biggest pop-up to that point on the show. To that crowd, All Japan was so over that the referee for All Japan got a bigger reaction than legends like Onita and Nobuhiko Takada. It seemed impossible to follow the thunderous reaction of Stan Hansen and Kenta Kobashi moments earlier, but Misawa's was clearly the biggest of the night. For the next 30 minutes, Misawa and Kobashi and Hansen battled Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao and Johnny Ace, current WWE Executive Vice President of Talent Relations John Laurinaitis, in a match that was so stiff you could hear every blow 100 yards away, with heat that never let down, and psychology a level above anything in pro wrestling not only at that time, but likely any time up to that point in pro wrestling history. It didn't matter that the fans had seen every high spot, every gimmick, real fights and a whole slew of some of the biggest stars and most charismatic performers in pro wrestling history for the previous 4.5 hours. They had also seen the emotion of Luthez having to fight back tears as the big screen played tapes of his famous battles with Rikidozan, while a wheelchair-bound Kentaro Oki got up as he was wheeled out of the ring, kissed the ring post and broke down and cried as he left the ring for the final time in his life. Every argument about what you can't follow and how long you can go and do on a show without burning out the audience early had been violated for the previous few hours. But it didn't matter. At the time, the top stars of All Japan Pro Wrestling were just that much better than anyone else in the world. Those days were long gone on Saturday night in Hiroshima, Japan, a city best known on a worldwide basis for having a nuclear bomb dropped on it without warning by the U.S. forces in 1945, that killed 90,000 civilians that day and probably as many as 200,000 within 5 years directly related to the residual effects of the radiation, and which ended World War II. Pro Wrestling Noah, only a few years removed from being the best pro wrestling promotion on the planet, was a struggling entity. They were one of the most publicized casualties of how the worldwide economic crisis had affected television. Nippon Television had broadcast pro wrestling since 1954, with it starting out as a physical morality play where a native North Korean posing as a Japanese national sports hero gained revenge on the huge Americans, who were actually two giant Canadians, who had destroyed that city and some others, rebuilding the psyche of a nation destroyed by the war. Pro wrestling for decades was a part of the national fabric. Rikidozan is still considered one of the 10 or 15 most influential men in the history of Japanese culture, closer in ranking to George Washington or Abraham Lincoln than to a sports hero. From the mid-60s through the 70s, the four biggest cultural sports stars were baseball legends Shigeo Nagashima and Sadaharu Oh of the Yomiuri Giants baseball team, and wrestlers Shohei Giant Baba and Kanji Antonio Inoki. More people watched some of the early pro wrestling matches on television, which was in its infancy in Japan, than any matches any time in the world. At another time in history, Saturday's show TV taping featuring a tag team title match would have been viewed by millions on network television, but in March, as part of making economic cutbacks because they had lost so much money due to the decline in advertising, NTV axed wrestling after 55 years, the oldest program in the history of the network. Of course, this was not the wrestling of Rikidozan, Baba, and Inoki, or even the heyday of Misawa. It was airing on Sunday nights at about 3 a.m., about 30 minutes of sometimes chopped-up matches. The exposure was limited to hardcores who would remember to tape it and assorted insomniacs. The time slot made it next to impossible to create new drawing cards. He had an excellent group of younger wrestlers that his company had trained, following in the footsteps of what he established in his prime. The younger hardcore fans saw them as stars, but they had virtually no casual name identity nor the exposure to get any. They had 2,300 fans that night, which by today's standards was a good crowd, at Hiroshima's Sogo Taikoken, also known as the Green Arena. It was taped for NTV's satellite station that only a small percentage of the population can get, and few outside the hardcore wrestling community ever watch. Just 5 days before his 47th birthday, Mitsuharu Misawa was a decade removed from the last year when he was the consensus greatest in-ring performer on the planet. In 1999, Misawa's mentor, Shohei Giant Baba, the legendary Cal Ripken Jr. of Japanese wrestling, who during his career was noted for only missing one match in the 80s due to injury, had missed the final shows of 1998, and for the first time, he wasn't going on the January tour. Instead, he was in the hospital in Tokyo, with the vague reports of why making people fear the worst. On January 24th, Baba watched his television show, featuring a singles match with his two biggest stars battling for his created Triple Crown world title in a match held 2 nights earlier in Osaka. 7 minutes into the match, Toshiaki Kawada suffered a legitimate broken arm early in the match when he went to deliver a spinning backfist, but instead his elbow cracked the top of Misawa's head with such force that both his wrist and forearm were broken. Kawada worked the remainder of the match, with limited use of one arm. He used a power bomb where he dropped Misawa on the top of his head, the dreaded Gonzo bomb spot, and later, a high kick to the face, followed by a brainbuster to win the Triple Crown at 24:15 on a show that drew a phenomenal 5.4 rating airing after midnight on a Sunday night. Given the time it aired with most people asleep, nearly half the television sets that were turned on at that point in Japan were watching the match. Baba, who started wrestling 39 years earlier and had likely seen as many great matches live during his lifetime as anyone who had ever lived, remarked that night that it was the greatest match he had ever seen. 7 days later he passed away at the age of 61 from renal cancer. Already the company's top star since winning the Triple Crown from Stan Hansen for the first time in 1992, after Baba's death, Misawa found himself in the exhausting position of being company president, booker, and the top wrestler in the world, all at the same time. His career at the top had survived multiple injuries that would have crippled most humans and ended the careers of most wrestlers. He worked through them and rarely missed a match, because of the mentality instilled in him to be tough and never complain. He could not go all out every night, but remained as good a big show wrestler as there was. He had learned how to work believable enough to bring people into his matches and have them believe the roller coaster rides were really the most exciting athletic competitions around, done well enough that they overcame his own lack of facial expressions, usually the death knell for successful drawing card. He regularly took psychotic bumps, most notably back suplexes where he and his partners in crime would be dropped on their heads. His neck, knees and back ached all the time. He relied on chiropractic help and acupuncture therapy but never used traditional medical treatment, nor in recent years did he take time off from the ring. 10 years after Baba's death, Misawa walked to the ring unsteady. He was terribly out of shape because he was injured too badly to train hard. Chain smoking is prevalent in Japan and Misawa was no different. It genuinely hurt to watch him. Still, For economic survival, there were times he had to headline, such as in the recent Global Tag Team Tournament, where he felt it necessary to give Go Shiozaki the star and credibility rub of being his tag team partner. Misawa had decided that Shiozaki, and not Takeshi Morishima because of the latter's weight problems, would be the superstar counted on to carry the promotion in the future. The talent was there, just not the credibility with the public. The first part of the push was giving Shiozaki several big wins to lead to a title challenge against GHC heavyweight champion Jun Akiyama, which he lost. To rebound, Shiozaki teamed with Misawa in April and May for the tag team tournament. Shiozaki would win the tournament and headline Budokan Hall, where hopefully his ability would show that he belonged in the spot. On May 6, Misawa headlined Budokan Hall for the record-setting 69th time in his career. A far cry from his 53 sellouts at Budokan Hall. There were only 7,300 fans there, one of the 2 or 3 smallest crowds he'd ever headlined the building in front of. It was a bad sign as it was the first Budokan Hall show since losing network television. Misawa's mark is likely the most sellouts as a headliner of any wrestler in a building of that size in the history of the business. The U.S. record for that sized arena is likely held by Bruno Sammartino, who sold out Madison Square Garden about 45 times in 130 main events. Misawa and Shiozaki won the Global Tag League tournament, beating Morishima and Kensuke Sasaki in the finals. In the match, the storyline was that Misawa was injured, thus keeping him out of the ring most of the match. Shiozaki single-handedly survived and won against the team being marketed as a Japanese modern version of the Road Warriors, complete with the same finishing move. When Kobashi was out fighting cancer in the second half of 2006, attendance had plummeted at the Budokan Hall shows that carried the company business. After going against tradition and putting the company's 2 best workers, Namichi Marufuji and Kenna, both less than 200 pounds, in the Budokan Hall main event spot, the first ever matchup of 2 junior heavyweights battling for the heavyweight title only did about 5,000 paid. For economic survival, Misawa, as the only wrestler on the roster who could consistently draw on top, had to win the title on December 10, 2006, nearly 4 years after he had decided to retire from the heavyweight title position with his last ever singles match of the year against Kobashi. His 15-month title reign wasn't filled with sellouts or legendary matches. It was a band-aid trying to be able to at least run big shows that would draw decent crowds and keep from bleeding badly until Kobashi's return would be a temporary cure. The hope was that his opponents, some of whom were among the most talented wrestlers in the business, could carry him enough to where the matches would be decent. Business wasn't good, but due to usually great undercard matches, the big shows were still well received. After dropping the title to Morishima, Misawa worked almost always in tags, often in the middle of the card, where his partners handled the vast majority of the ring time. While never publicly acknowledged, the plan had been in place for Misawa to retire, first in 2007, but with Kobashi out, the feeling was he was needed as world champion. Then the plan was for him to retire when Kobashi could return full-time, but with the company struggling, the date had been put off. He had told his wife the prior week that he would retire at the end of the year, and had gone so far as to tell Ryu Nakata, who business head of the company on Tuesday, that he would retire this year but that he didn't want to have a farewell tour. But no matter what he thought he should do physically or was thinking at home, the odds were just as good that he would end up like Baba, who wrestled until 2 months before his death, and until the last tour of his career, had gone more than 14 straight years without missing one match. He could work easy trios matches in the middle of the card where his partners would do all the work, for years to come, since his presence on the shows was important for company survival. On the last night of his life, Misawa and Shiozaki, coming off their tournament win, were to challenge Bison Smith and Akitoshi Saito for the GHC tag team titles. Misawa's neck was bothering him during the match, so he must have worsened the damage he's had for years at a show over the previous week. He had believed he suffered a shoulder injury earlier in the tour. He was having a hard time, because this was a title match, which meant you had to work at that level. After Shiozaki worked most of the way, Misawa made the hot tag on both guys, mostly throwing his standing elbows to Smith, before getting cut off. Smith delivered an iron claw slam, one of his finishers, but Misawa kicked out, and Smith tagged to Saito. Saito did a series of moves, one of which was to be a back suplex. It was described as a 7 when it came to the degree of danger on a 1 to 10 scale, but his head did hit the mat. Misawa just laid there. He immediately told ref Shuichi Nishinaga, "I can't move," and then passed out. Nishinaga immediately stopped the match at the 27:03 mark, at about 8:45 p.m. At first, the crowd didn't quite understand what they were seeing. Because Japanese pro wrestling is not regulated, there was not, as would be the case if it was a New Japan show, a doctor at the show. Misawa wasn't moving, but to the fans, they'd seen people sell that all the time, and had seen plenty of spectacular knockouts in televised kickboxing and MMA matches. The first sign of a big problem was, when over the microphone, they asked if there was a doctor in the arena. There was a local doctor who was a spectator, and came to the ring and saw there was no pulse, and tried to perform CPR. He used automated external defibrillator pads to try and shock Misawa's heart into beating, without success. Very quickly, all the wrestlers came to the ring, and were all stunned and very nervous. A lot of women in the crowd were crying and there were chants of his name. Some of the wrestlers, in a panic, were screaming his name as well, begging for him to hear them and for him to respond. Fans watched, and soon sensed the panic as Misawa started turning purple. EMTs arrived and worked on him for a long time, trying without success. This scene of them working on him aired on a number of national news and sportscasts over the weekend. He was rushed to Hiroshima College Hospital. Saito went to the hospital to stand by his side. Morishima was told to stay at the arena and address the crowd, as most of them had stayed, waiting for word on what they had just seen. Morishima told the fans that Misawa was at the hospital and his condition was critical, but said, "We don't know anything new." He said somberly, "Thank you for caring." Misawa was pronounced dead in the hospital at 10:10 p.m. In the history of pro wrestling, there have been probably 100 or more deaths either in the ring, or in the hospital shortly thereafter from circumstances related to a match. But with all due respect to Owen Hart, or a regional legend like Ray Gunkel, none of those people were near Misawa's level of stature. The belief was that he died in the ring, but they publicly announced he died at the hospital so those in the arena wouldn't think that he died in front of them. His family was called and flew in, and saw the doctor the next morning, who told them the cause of death. The family took the body home to Koshigaya, Saitama, where they live, and asked that the cause of death remain confidential. They had a secret funeral right away and he was cremated. Pro Wrestling Noah is going to arrange a public service for fans to attend on July 4th at Differ Ariake. Business manager Ryu Nakata said Differ Ariake will be the site because it is the company's home base, and where the company's offices are located. He noted that this was where Misawa worked both in and out of the ring, and it was the site of the first show of the promotion. The next night at the house show, Noah Vice President Mitsuo Momota said that he could not reveal the cause of death because the family asked it be kept confidential. However, the Hiroshima Police Department report on the incident released his cause of death as cervical spinal cord trauma, after interviewing the doctors. The actual injury was a shattered C1 and C2 vertebrae, essentially meaning his head and spine were no longer connected, which led to him suffering cardiopulmonary arrest. It was roughly the same injury that actor Christopher Reeve suffered in 1995 when he was thrown off by a horse he was riding. Reeve would have died in that accident without the immediate medical care he received. Even if Misawa had survived, and it would have taken a miracle for that to happen, he would have likely been a paraplegic. Most likely, if he had gone to a doctor in the US, like Steve Austin or DDP did when they had serious neck injuries, his level of his neck damage would have been discovered. It's very possible, if not likely, he'd have been told like Austin, DDP and Ted DiBiase had, that one more bad bump could leave him as a paraplegic. DiBiase retired at that point, although in the last year has talked of coming back for one last match. Austin and DDP wrestled a few times after that diagnosis, but got out for good, in the case of Austin, spurning some huge offers to come back, and at times considering them. Misawa never got that medical opinion, even though he was diagnosed 2 years ago with a cervical sprain in a match he suffered a concussion in. Even the Japanese media reported after his death that he should not have been wrestling at this point. To the shock of many people, the tour continued with a show the next night in Fukuoka, where Akiyama was scheduled to defend the GHC heavyweight title against Takeshi Rigio. Tons of fans came to the Noah offices in Tokyo leaving flowers. In Fukuoka, a huge walk-up crowd came to the Hakata Star Lanes, a 2,600-seat converted bowling alley that is now, because wrestling is no longer drawing big crowds, the home for most of the promotions in Japan when they come to the city. A large throng was milling around the arena long before the show was scheduled to start, and selling it out. It was surreal as everyone involved tried to act like it was just another day and another show, almost as if pretending would take everyone's minds off what obviously everyone was thinking. Going out of your way to do what you would normally do was making it so obvious that it reminded everyone that this was no normal day, and this was no normal show. And it couldn't be. All Misawa merchandise that they had brought to last the entire tour sold out before the show started. They opened the show with a 10 count for Misawa, as shows did all over the world on that day, of major promotions running around the world the next day. Only WWE and TNA failed to acknowledge it at their house shows, although both did post messages on their website. WWE did not acknowledge it during Raw, but CM Punk did manage to sneak a mention in, writing his name in huge letters on the tape on his wrists and forearms. They played his music one last time and fans chanted his name. The death got the expected huge coverage in Japan, on network news and talk shows, lead stories in sports sections. At least one sports newspaper got the word late Saturday night, and stopped the presses for the Sunday edition to redo its front page. It was the lead story in every sports newspaper in the country, and top story on the Google and Yahoo Japan websites. Reaction to the death was worldwide. There was even a loud Misawa chant the next day that started out of nowhere at a major fireworks show in Dusseldorf, Germany, a city with a large Japanese population, where transplanted Japanese talked about seeing his matches with Tsuruta, Kawada and Kobashi on television. But there were highbrow papers in Japan that gave it very little coverage, limited to a few graphs. NHK Television's news, considered the most authoritative in the country, infuriated wrestling fans by making the decision that the death was not major news, with only 1 minute of coverage on the prime-time newscast. To older editors, wrestling was something huge in the days of Rikidozan, and certainly Baba and Inoki were household names. Tsuruta's death was covered huge, as were deaths of people like Luthez, Karl Gotch, and Fred Blassie. The country practically went into mourning when Baba died, and from a sports standpoint, Bruiser Brody's death got nearly 2 months' worth of regular coverage, yet Terry Gordy's death got minimal coverage. The leading English-language newspaper, the Japan Times, had a 7-paragraph Japanese wire service story buried in the in-brief section. Aside from mentioning him in the lead as one of the most popular wrestlers in Japan, the article talked almost exclusively about the circumstances of his death that night in Sapporo, and coverage of his entire career came down to 2 sentences, making his professional debut in 1981. Misawa became popular partly for wearing his trademark mask designed to look like a tiger's head. He set up wrestling organization Pro Wrestling Noah in 2000 and became its president. On the NTV morning show hosted by Kazuo Tokumitsu, something of a Japanese version of Walter Cronkite, he devoted 20 minutes the next morning to coverage of Misawa's death. Tokumitsu, a powerful player in NTV, was friends with Misawa and was said to be one of the key guys at the network arguing against cutting the wrestling show a few months ago. Tokumitsu got his first national exposure as the lead wrestling announcer on the network in the Rikidozan era, and he was a player on the popular 70s network comedy show that The Destroyer was on. NTV announced that the day after his public funeral, on July 5, they would air a 90-minute special on his life, replaying his most famous matches. Special commemorative magazines were being rushed to hit the newsstands. It was even a front-page story in the US on the ESPN website and was covered in the sports section in Australia in the Sydney Morning Herald. After the moment of silence to start the show in Fukuoka, Akiyama, 39, then came out and announced he had herniated the disc between his L4 and L5 vertebrae and would be out of action indefinitely. He had been working through a lot of pain, with the usual Japanese athlete mentality that you deny pain because admitting it is considered a weakness, really not appreciably different than the attitude of American athletes, except that trait is, as a rule, stronger in Japanese because of being taught never to complain. After what happened the night before, he looked at his own situation, got himself examined. In fact, this was a wake-up call for many in the industry who routinely did their job and ignored their discomfort because that's what you do in the wrestling business. Akiyama said he would have to vacate the championship, and it was announced that Shiozaki would face Rikyo for the title. Akiyama himself is under a lot of pressure, because the company is expecting him to take over Misawa's front office duties. Vice President Momota said they would be having a meeting on June 23, the day after the current tour ends, and discuss the direction of the company, and expect to announce a new president within 3 months. 27-year-old Shiozaki pinned Rikyo in 22:37 with the Go Flasher to win the championship. Shiozaki has the talent to be the top star of the promotion, but with the television situation as it is, he's never going to have the exposure to be a major star. The reality of the business today is no matter how talented or charismatic the young talent is, the television vehicle isn't there to create a new Misawa, Kobashi, Keiji Muto, or Riki Choshu. Shiozaki was in the role of a guy who had exciting matches against the top and middle guys, but always lost in the end until going to the US in 2008 to work for ROH. Unlike Morishima, who was a world champion in ROH to prepare for him to come back and be the top guy, Shiozaki was a mid-carder in ROH, and while it was hoped he would eventually get to the top position, it was not scheduled to be anytime soon. People aren't ready for him as a world champion, but at this point, he may have been the best option. The place was very emotional due to the circumstances, and they had a decent main event. Shiozaki said nothing after winning the title, which was symbolic, since Misawa rarely did mic work after winning a major championship. The most vivid scene of the night was Saito, 43, who had to be talked out of announcing his retirement that day, getting on his hands and knees to a large framed photo of Misawa, crying and being apologetic. It was actually at that point when fans realized that Misawa died directly related to the move, as opposed to the possibility it was a heart attack suffered in the heat of battle. There have been an endless number of high-profile pro wrestler deaths over the past 25 years. There were the drug deaths, the accidents in and out of the ring, and even a high-profile murder. Many were the result of the lifestyle of being a high-profile pro wrestling star and falling to the easy temptations. Some, like Eddie Guerrero, may have been, as Dusty Rhodes said right after his death, that he died trying to be a main eventer, essentially steroids and growth hormone to try and overcompensate for his small stature that was the only thing holding him from that status. Misawa was the first to die not from trying to be a champion, nor from the lifestyle of the spoils from that success, but because of being the champion. In a country that thrives on symbolism, there were plenty here. It was noted in some media reports how the last move of the match, called in Japanese Noten Sakasa Toshi, or Luthez-style Greco-Roman backdrop, was the same move Thez used to pin Rikidozan in Honolulu when Thez was world champion. Beating Rikidozan, who never lost in Japan, and being the first world champion when wrestling became huge in Japan made Thez larger than life. It was why the later Thez vs. Rikidozan matches in Japan were so big. Something to the effect of him dying from the original great finishing move in Japanese culture. Others used it as a symbolic end of pro wrestling, that began with Thez doing the move to Rikidozan and ended with Misawa dying after the same move. In many of the news reports, they aired Misawa's first ever match on television, on April 22, 1983, from Sapporo, in the finals of the Luthez Trophy, for all the younger wrestlers. Thez was brought in to referee all the matches, with the idea that the young wrestlers would do their best with the most sacred wrestler in the ring with them watching. Misawa lost that match to Shiro Koshinaka, but it was clear he was the better of the two. The idea was the winner of the tournament would get to go on a foreign tour where they could gain experience to come back as a star. It wasn't quite Dana White after the Forrest Griffin-Stefan Bonner fight, but Baba said after the match that he was so impressed with it, that both of them could go to Mexico. The movie The Wrestler, heavily advertised on all the wrestling TV shows, debuted in Japan with essentially the same ending. While Randy the Ram was in no way portrayed as a Misawa-level star, he was past his prime, working a smaller show, and in the final scene, at least in theory since the ending of the movie was ambiguous, he passed away. Even more of that symbolism was that Misawa's final match in the United States, on November 3, 2007, for Ring of Honor at the Manhattan Center, where he defended the GHC title and pinned Kenta. Despite being run down with the flu, the combination of the crowd that was hot for everything, seeing him as a legend they had grown up watching only on videotape, and Kenta's ability to carry him, led to his last singles match that was in the 4 stars range. Among the people watching the match were Darren Aronofsky, the producer of The Wrestler, coming with Nicolas Cage, who at the same was scheduled to star in the movie before it ended up with Mickey Rourke in the role. The problems that led to the end of the All Japan Pro Wrestling Organization as people knew it, were due to problems with Misawa and Motoko Baba, the widow and owner of the company, that took place after Giant Baba's death. Misawa was the company's biggest star, and was the locker room leader. It was a locker room of athletes and he was the star quarterback. The year earlier, Baba had made the decision to have Misawa replace him as booker for the first time in the 26-year history of the company. Her husband handpicked Misawa, who he and his wife, who had no children of their own, treated as their golden child, to be the top star of the next generation, carefully grooming him, even though Toshiaki Kawada and Kenta Kobashi were actually more dynamic performers. She herself, running the business of the company in the 90s when they set a record with more than 200 consecutive Tokyo sellouts, noted that it was the popularity of Misawa and Kobashi that led to the company's most successful business period. Whenever people would bring up why business was on fire, and there were a lot of big stars in the mix, she would say at the time that it was Misawa and Kobashi that were the reasons for all the sellouts. The record streak started right after Misawa beat Tsuruta on June 8, 1990, at Budokan Hall. The match itself actually came 500 tickets from selling out, the last time such a thing would happen for years, and continued on every show in the city through early 1996, which is almost surely a record that has never been approached by any company in any major city in the history of the business. Still, when her husband died, she made the decision to hand the presidency over to Mitsuo Momota, a popular aging prelim wrestler who wasn't big enough or good enough to make it in spite of royal bloodlines as the son of Rikidozen. Mitsuharu Misawa came from a broken home, and grew up as a fan of All Japan Pro Wrestling, and in particular Tomomi Jumbo Tsuruta, who was the young star of the company. At the age of 12, he decided he was going to become a pro wrestler for that promotion. A few years later, he wanted to drop out of school and become a pro wrestler. He met Tsuruta at the All Japan dojo wanting to sign up. Tsuruta told him, "I joined All Japan after I graduated from college and got a degree. I think you should graduate high school. That would be the best thing for your life." Tsuruta told him that he had been recruited into pro wrestling after he won several national college wrestling championships, and then gone on to the Olympics. He told Misawa that if he was serious about pro wrestling, he should concentrate on becoming the best amateur wrestler he could be. It was 13 years later when Tsuruta, at the time the top star in the company, was shocked when Giant Baba asked him a few hours before their match to lose in a Budokan Hall main event to Misawa. That wasn't how wrestling in Japan worked at that time, but as history has shown pretty clearly, Baba's instincts and seeing the audience reaction with loud Misawa chants coming out of nowhere every few minutes in the hour before the show started in the building, as well as in the hours before outside the ring in the giant line to get in the lone exit, sensed it was the right time to do the unexpected. It was a unique atmosphere that night, something that I'd never experienced before and never experienced live since at any sporting event. Part of the reason that match became so famous and turned business around, the Japanese equivalent of the December 25, 1982, Ric Flair vs. Kerry Von Erich cage match in Dallas, which set up the Freebirds vs. Von Erich's feud, or the Steve Austin I Quit match with Bret Hart and title win over Shawn Michaels with Mike Tyson as referee, which led to Austin's popularity exploding, is because everyone in the arena that night wanted to see Misawa win. And pretty much nobody really expected that he would. Baba was sitting at the concession stand near the entrance of the building, seeing the huge business for Misawa merchandise almost out of nowhere, hearing the buzz of the crowd, and sent the message to Tsuruta in the dressing room. 3 weeks before what turned out to be the most pivotal match of his career, All Japan was running at the Tokyo Gym. During a match with Tiger Mask and Kawada vs. Yoshiaki Yatsu and Samson Fuyuki, after Tiger Mask pinned Fuyuki with a German suplex, he told Kawada to untie his mask. After doing so, Misawa pulled his mask off and threw it to the crowd, grabbed the mic, and challenged Tsuruta to a singles match, which headlined the June 8, 1990 show at Budokan Hall. It was a moment that nobody could have fully expected the reaction to, as Tiger Mask was certainly a star, but he was not at the time that big of a star. But the crowd exploded in chants of Misawa, which started happening at all the house shows over the next few weeks. It was certainly the reaction they wanted, but far better than even the most optimistic expectations. After being sent to Mexico from his performance in the Luthez Cup, a little over a year later, on August 26, 1984, Misawa returned, with the idea of being a superstar, as the reincarnation of Tiger Mask. Baba had reached a deal with Iki Kajiwara, who created the Tiger Mask character, a popular comic book and cartoon character. In the original television cartoon, where Tiger Mask feuded with his rival, Black Tiger, an animated version of Baba was one of the characters. It was New Japan in 1981 who came up with the Tiger Mask concept on a wrestler, Satoru Sayama, who became a sensation who was largely responsible for the success of every smaller wrestler who made it in Japan. Sayama had retired a year earlier, and a series of scandals and unhappy wrestlers had left New Japan with a lot of problems. Baba was in the process of making aggressive moves to build his own company at the expense of his rival, and a few months later, came very close to finishing New Japan after a talent raid. One of his moves was buying the rights to the Tiger Mask character, and picking Misawa for the role. Misawa was only 22 when he had the spotlight put on him, as in his debut, pushed heavily for more than a month on television and magazines at the Dinan Coliseum in Tokyo. A sellout crowd of 13,000 fans saw Tiger Mask pin one of Mexico's best workers of the era, La Fiera, with Sayama's trademark Tiger Suplex, on a show headlined by Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen retaining the PWF World Tag Team titles against Dory Funk and Baba. His push was so strong that soon, at the Korakuen Hall main event, Tiger Mask and Tsuruta drew with Baba and Genichiro Tenryu. Baba brought in a steady stream of top junior heavyweight and high-flying talent to face Tiger Mask, including Jerry Estrada, Pirata Morgan, Chavo Guerrero, as well as the two biggest rivals of the original Tiger Mask, Dynamite Kid, and Kunyaki Kobayashi, eventually winning the NWA International Junior Heavyweight Championship. But after knee problems, Baba made the call to move him to the heavyweight division in late 1985. It would be unfair to call him a great success as Tiger Mask, nor a failure. His lack of size hurt him, And he didn't have quite the flashy ability or charisma of the original Tiger Mask that he was being constantly compared with. The timing was largely because All Japan for the previous few years had been built around Tsuruta and Genichiro Tenryu feuding over the top position. Tenryu received an unheard-of offer at the time of $800,000 per year by Hachiro Tanaka, the billionaire owner of Megon Super Opticals, to head up a new wrestling group called Super World Sports. The idea was to elevate Misawa and Kawada to be more viable main event headliners against Tsuruta. After getting the message from Giant Baba, Tsuruta, shocked, told the messenger to ask if they could do the finish as a count-out. Baba got the message and had a one-word message to give to Tsuruta. No. That was the end of the discussion. After a spectacular match, which video could simply not capture the emotion in the building that night, Misawa rolled through on a Tsuruta pin in 24:06 to get the win. The vast majority, easily 80% of the audience that night, had tears streaming down their face as they chanted "was in tears." Most rushed to the ticket tables to get tickets for the next show at Budokan Hall. There are times when something big happens that leads to great changes that looking back in hindsight you can tell, but wouldn't be evident that night. This was not one of those times. 19 years later, on the day after his death, it was that match, clips of the finish of which aired all over news and sports shows in Japan all weekend, that was considered the most noteworthy of his career. But in 1999, it was Tsuruta who went to Motoko Baba and told her that Misawa was the leader of the boys and needed to be the person put in charge. Motoko Baba was convinced by Tsuruta to go with Misawa, but then forced Tsuruta out of his executive position in the company, and he left Japan for a new life as a professor at Portland State University. But Motoko Baba did keep her word, as 2 days after the Giant Baba Memorial Show at the Tokyo Dome, where Misawa pinned Vader to regain the Triple Crown, Motoko Baba announced Misawa as the new president of the company. But the relationship between the two was an immediate disaster. Motoko Baba went from surrogate mother to a teenager just out of high school from a broken home, to mother-in-law from hell. They had different ideas about everything. He wanted to expand the business and she wanted to run things carefully, and not spend additional money. Her view was the popularity of the company had fallen from its peak and wrestling would never be as popular as it once was due to the television situation. At the time, the company was still very profitable. Issues between the two were both financial and creative. Misawa wanted to increase the pay of the wrestlers as well as give them medical benefits, but Motoko Baba was against those changes, which also led to the wrestlers siding with Misawa. Misawa wanted to use the profits to help build the business, while Motoko Baba was content with keeping things status quo. Misawa went to NTV and said that he was planning on quitting and starting a new company, and that virtually every wrestler was also fed up with Motoko Baba, nicknamed Dragon Lady, in the business, and would be going with him. Motoko Baba's role with All Japan as far back as anyone could remember was to play bad cop, the bearer of all bad news, allowing Giant Baba to be good cop. This enabled Giant Baba to keep almost a pristine reputation both in and out of the business, which they felt was important since Baba was the face and image of the company, and it's not the easiest thing for a pro wrestling promoter to maintain a great public image. NTV executives had been through this before. In 1972, when Japan Pro Wrestling, Rikidozan's original company, was falling apart due to the gambling problems of the major shareholders, Baba, the company's top star, went to them and said he had to get out and form his own company. Inoki had gotten out earlier. Not only did NTV at that time say they were with him, but they even financed the formation of the new group. NTV officials told Misawa they were with him, but told him to hold off and keep quiet. The agreement was not to speak of this publicly or do anything about this for 1 year after the meeting. NTV felt they wanted close to a year and a half after the death of Giant Baba before they were willing to drop the All Japan television show. The network had a 28-year relationship with All Japan Pro Wrestling, NTV. Giant Baba was a top television star on the network dated back to a 1963 match against Killer Kowalski. To much of the population, NTV and Giant Baba were thought of as almost one and the same. In fact, the network itself, the wrestling show, and Baba's ring entrance music was one and the same. Tsuruta passed away from complications while undergoing kidney transplant surgery in the Philippines on May 13, 2000, at the age of 49. 2 days after his death, at the June 15 Noah show in Kagoshima, before the show they observed a minute of silence for him. It was noted backstage by the veteran wrestlers that it was 9 years to the day when they all sent in their resignation letters en masse to All Japan. On June 16, 2000, a press conference was held at Differ Ariake, a new 1,800-seat building built specifically for pro wrestling in the Ariake suburb of Tokyo, where Misawa announced for formation of his new promotion, with 26 of the company's 28 full-time native wrestlers aligning with him. Only Kawada and Masafuchi stayed with All Japan. The foreigners had largely been kept in the dark, and all the main veterans who were under contract to All Japan stayed loyal to the group, with the exception of Vader. Johnny Ace, who was practically office, saw the lay of the land better than most and established an escape route, getting a job behind the scenes in helping to lay out matches with World Championship Wrestling, which directly led to him being hired as Jim Ross' assistant in talent relations when WCW went down. 3 days later, NTV announced that the final All Japan TV show on the network would be June 21, 2000, a 45-minute special, where they would announce why they were canceling the show. They announced that starting a week later, they would do a weekly show called Coliseum, which largely focused on news about K1 and clips of Misawa and his wrestlers until they started broadcasting the Noah matches. Misawa recognized he was past his prime, and Kobashi, the other top star, was plagued with injuries to his knees and elbows. In the last few years with All Japan, Akiyama had come into his own as a top performer, and the first big move Misawa made in the formation of the new promotion was to have Akiyama beat both Misawa and Kobashi to establish him as the top star to carry the company. Pro Wrestling Noah debuted on August 5, 2000, at Differ Ariake, using a trademark green-colored ring, based on Misawa as the face of the company since his trademark were his green long tights. The first night couldn't have been more of a success. Of course, starting in a 1,800-seat arena instead of Budokan Hall was to create an illusion. Tickets sold out in minutes. Scalpers outside the building on the night of the show were getting $2,700 for the $60 ringside seats and $800 for standing room. The main event was a 2 of 3 falls match, where the winning team would then face each other in a singles match the next night. Kobashi and Akiyama won 2 straight falls from Misawa and Akira Tao. Akiyama made Misawa pass out in just 2 minutes using a guillotine, a move that had not been used for decades as a finisher in pro wrestling. Misawa sold it as if he was out cold from the choke and laid there motionless. To put over the hold, Misawa was given CPR as a work at ringside to revive him, making the weird coincidence of the same scene in his first and last match in the company. Akiyama then pinned Tao in 17:45 to win the second fall. As the referee held Kobashi and Akiyama's hands up, Akiyama then laid out Kobashi with a back suplex. The next night, in a symbolic move, Kobashi, who held the Triple Crown title for All Japan at the time of the split, never losing it, thus having the aura as being the real world champion, was pinned by Akiyama in 24:25. Just before they left All Japan, Misawa booked Akiyama to beat him in a high-profile singles match at Budokan Hall, the arena he was king in and where he rarely lost. The first night saw Misawa and Tao observe a gentleman's agreement not to attack Kobashi's bad knees, but the second night, the story of the match was Akiyama violating it, working the knees for much of the match, and finishing Kobashi with the guillotine. Kobashi also passed out, and was left selling that he was unconscious for 2 minutes to get Akiyama and his new move over. But Pro Wrestling Noah soon struggled after the original novelty wore off. Misawa became the first GHC heavyweight champion so Akiyama could beat him one more time, and people would see it as Akiyama beating an established world champion to get the title, as opposed to being the first champion. While Akiyama was tremendous in the role of the young wrestler nipping at the heels of the big stars, as the top guy, for whatever reason, it didn't work. As a young challenger, he possessed the fire to get the crowd behind him, but somehow as champion and as the top star, no matter how strong he was pushed, he never established the level of credibility to thrive in that role. The company really started taking off with the Misawa title win over Yoshihiro Takayama on September 23, 2002. Takayama was at the peak of his stardom because his match a few months earlier on a Pride show with Don Frye became one of the most famous fights in Japanese history. Off that fight, since every sports fan in the country heard about it and ended up seeing it in one of its million replays, Takayama had become the biggest star in Japanese pro wrestling, and Misawa was an established legend, bringing a full house to Budokan Hall. This win gave the title the credibility of world titles of the past in pro wrestling. When Misawa dropped the title on March 1, 2003, to Kobashi, it was the final passing of the torch. Fans at that point took Kobashi as the biggest star in the promotion, and in Japanese wrestling, as he had the charisma and ability to bring out emotion as a top guy that Akiyama lacked. His 2-year reign as champion was an incredible success, particularly for a guy who looked to be through 2 years earlier. But the problem was, Kobashi's body had been ravaged by all those incredible matches. But from that point on, the ups and downs of the company had largely coincided with the health of Kobashi and his ability to be used in the top position. The company was in many ways the best pro wrestling company in the world after the Kobashi win, with Budokan Hall matches always selling out unless Kobashi was booked with a weak opponent. The company peaked with 2 events at the Tokyo Dome, both voted as the best shows in their particular year. On July 10, 2004, before a sellout of 52,000 fans, Kobashi beat Akiyama in an incredible main event, while Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa beat Keiji Muto and Taiokiya. It was the only time Muto and Misawa were ever in a match together. When Muto was the top star in New Japan and Misawa in All Japan, for years he wanted to do a singles match, always saying that the finish, always a problem in those kind of matches due to politics in the era when double countouts were no longer considered acceptable, would not be an issue. Muto always said the right finish would be to put Misawa over clean, a unique admission because of the big star the country's 2 biggest promotions. It was an acknowledgement by the larger promotion that his opposite number was actually better in the role of being a real world champion. But relations between the companies wouldn't allow that to happen, and by this time, when the politics had changed and the setting was right, the feeling was it would be better as a tag match, where they could trade doing their best known spots and not be in so long where it would be obvious both were no longer what they were. On July 18, 2005, before 45,000 fans, Misawa beat Kawada in their final singles meeting and Kobashi beat Sasaki. The Misawa vs. Kawada match was still very good as far as storytelling, but nothing close to their matches in the 90s. It had the atmosphere going on last as being a major happening, even though when the show was over, everyone was talking about Kobashi vs. Sasaki as the real dream match of the night. Misawa and Kawada started as high school wrestling teammates 27 years earlier as Ashikaga Kogyo High School, at the time a high school wrestling power. Misawa was a year older and a year ahead in school. Misawa wrestled at 187 pounds, while Kawada wrestled at 165. When Misawa was a senior in 1980, he won the National High School Wrestling Championship. After graduation, he gave Kawada his school jacket, essentially passing the torch to him to follow his lead the next year. Misawa joined All Japan Pro Wrestling the following March when they started their 1981 training camp. At the same time, Kawada followed in his footsteps, winning the National High School Wrestling Championship. Kawada actually was more of a fan of New Japan growing up. His dream was to go to New Japan, which was the more popular of the 2 promotions. But Misawa in high school was like his big brother. He was treated well, getting to shine some and losing undercard matches, particularly when tag teaming with Shiro Koshinaka. Misawa convinced him All Japan was more a family atmosphere. Kawada went to the 1982 All Japan camp instead of the New Japan camp, was the star of the camp, and very quickly into his pro career showed signs of being a great wrestler. They were tag team partners, tag team champions, singles world champions, and had some of the greatest matches in history against each other. But they had a falling out after both became stars. Exactly what it was about seems to be a secret. Americans who were regulars remember a brutal fist fight the 2 had after a show. Like one of their matches, neither would quit and it had to be broken up, but Misawa's face certainly looked the worse for wear when it was over. The story was kept from the public, and when Misawa's face was bruised up the next few days, people just figured it was from a stiff match, because it wasn't like bruises were foreign to those wrestlers when they worked that style. Some felt it was frustration, because Kawada was probably the better athlete of the 2, and the stronger performer, but Misawa was the chosen one because he was better looking and simply booked to be the bigger star of the 2, and Misawa had the internal respect as top guy. In 2000, when Misawa believed all the top wrestlers were going to stick with Misawa, Kawada told him he wasn't coming, at the time figuring he could finally be the top guy when staying, and word was about that New Japan was going to work with All Japan, so it was natural that Kawada would be the All Japan star to headline Tokyo Dome matches in what was sure to be a huge feud. The original Kawada vs. Sasaki feud of the All Japan top star vs. New Japan top star was tremendous, drawing 2 sellouts to the Dome, but Kawada in New Japan didn't have the legs as a draw expected. But this was 5 years later at the Tokyo Dome, and billed as the final act of the story. At this point both were Hall of Fame legends who had one of the greatest in-ring rivalries in wrestling history. Performing in front of a huge crowd, in what was expected to be their last match against each other, there was a good chance, and as it turned out it was, the last singles match either man would have on that kind of a stage. The last of the magic moments was on December 7, 2007. In Kobashi's return after being out of action for 17 months after having his kidney removed due to cancer, he returned for the final sellout at Budokan Hall. With 2,500 standing room seats sold before they had no choice but to turn people away, and turned away thousands, it was the largest pro wrestling crowd in the 41 years pro wrestling had run in that arena. Kobashi and Takayama faced Misawa and Akiyama. It was as emotional a match as the 4 ever had. partly because it was clear watching it that it would be the last time it would be able to pull something like this off. The style had destroyed 3 of the 4. Kobashi had dozens of surgeries and the cancer had taken a lot out of him physically that he would never get back, although on this night, for 27 minutes, the emotion convinced people they were seeing a miracle, and that the Kobashi of old had returned. Misawa had been physically through for years. Takayama had a stroke a few years earlier after a brutal match with Sasaki, likely an accumulation of all the head poundings he had taken both as a pro wrestler and a fighter, whose claim to fame was his ability and willingness to take all-out shots to the head. Still, because of how difficult it is to make new stars without real television, Takayama, who was on the Noah tour this week, is currently the Triple Crown champion in all Japan. Akiyama was the one of the 4 still healthy. But he still couldn't cross that line from being a great wrestler to being the guy who could carry the company. Days later, there remained a state of uneasiness within the company. With a few exceptions, Misawa was the team leader, and for the younger guys, company owner, for as long as they had been in the business. There was a recognition setting in that it was the end of an era, and complete uncertainty as to what the new era would bring, but with the recognition things would not be the same, and they would never be what they once were. Most famous in-ring deaths. Note, this is a combination of actual deaths in the ring, injuries that led to deaths in the hospital, and deaths in the dressing rooms or later at the hospital or other places shortly after a match. Misawa's Match of the Year place winners. June 12, 1985 Tokyo vs. Kunyaki Kobayashi first place. June 8, 1990 Tokyo vs. Jumbo Tsuruta second place. April 20, 1991 Tokyo with Toshiaki Kawada and Kenta Kobashi vs. Jumbo Tsuruta and Akira Tao and Masa Fuchi ninth place. June 3, 1994 Tokyo vs. Toshiaki Kawada second place. May 21, 1994 Sapporo with Kenta Kobashi vs. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao 7th place. July 28, 1994 Tokyo vs. Steve Williams 13th place. January 24, 1995 Yamagata with Kenta Kobashi vs. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao 4th place. June 9, 1995 Tokyo with Kenta Kobashi vs. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao 7th place. April 2, 1995 Tokyo with Kenta Kobashi and Stan Hansen vs. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao and Johnny Ace 14th place. July 24, 1995 Tokyo vs. Toshiaki Kawada 17th place. April 15, 1995 Tokyo vs. Akira Tao 18th place. June 7, 1996 Tokyo with Jun Akiyama vs. Steve Williams and Johnny Ace 1st place. May 23, 1996 Sapporo with Jun Akiyama vs. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao 4th place. September 5, 1996 Tokyo with Jun Akiyama vs. Steve Williams and Johnny Ace 16th place. January 20, 1997 Osaka vs. Kenta Kobashi 2nd place. June 6, 1997 Tokyo vs. Toshiaki Kawada 5th place. December 6, 1996 with Jun Akiyama vs. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao 7th place. In 1997 awards. October 21, 1997 Tokyo vs. Kenta Kobashi 9th place. October 31, 1998 Tokyo vs. Kenta Kobashi 1st place. May 1, 1998 Tokyo vs. Toshiaki Kawada 4th place. December 5, 1997 Tokyo with Jun Akiyama vs. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao 6th place. In 1998 awards. June 11, 1999 Tokyo vs. Kenta Kobashi 1st place. March 6, 1999 Tokyo with Yoshinari Ogawa vs. Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama 4th place. January 22, 1999 Osaka vs. Toshiaki Kawada 6th place. October 23, 1999 Nagoya with Yoshinari Ogawa vs. Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama 7th place. May 2, 1999 Tokyo vs. Vader 14th place. October 30, 1999 Tokyo vs. Vader 15th place. April 11, 2000 Kanazawa vs. Kenta Kobashi 10th place. March 2, 2001 Tokyo with Jun Akiyama vs. Shinya Hashimoto and Yuji Nagata 20th place. February 17, 2002 Tokyo with Kenta Kobashi vs. Jun Akiyama and Yuji Nagata 6th place. September 23, 2002 Tokyo vs. Yoshihiro Takayama 19th place. March 1, 2003 Tokyo vs. Kenta Kobashi 1st place. April 25, 2004 Tokyo with Yoshinari Ogawa vs. Kenta and Namichi Marufuji 11th place. UFC 99 pay-per-view poll results. Thumbs up 79, 77.5%. Thumbs down 5, 0.4, 9%. In the middle 17.6%. Best match. Rich Franklin vs. Vanderlei Silva 71. Dan Hardy vs. Marcus Davis 19. Cain Velasquez vs. Czech Congo 8. Worst match poll. Spencer Fisher vs. Quo Uno 39. Mirko Cro Cop vs. Mostafa Al Turk 25. Based on emails, fax messages and phone calls to the Observer as of Tuesday, June 16. The WWE's latest big move was the return of Donald Trump as a regular character in the role of the new owner of Raw. Vince McMahon said he had a big announcement early in a 3-hour Raw on June 15 coming from the Time Warner Cable Arena in Charlotte. Early in the show, he said he had received a great offer from someone he didn't expect. It was something he never envisioned happening, but that he had sold the Raw brand to Trump. While the McMahon-Trump feud in 2007 led to the biggest money show in the history of the industry, the crowd of about 12,000 reacted like they were watching a television rerun. Part of the problem was they had done a pre-taped interview with Trump and were playing it on the screen with McMahon reacting, and the time was off, and it was so obvious it was pre-taped. Also, nobody bought the premise of the story. It came out of nowhere. McMahon tried to give it credence, saying he had gotten older with the idea it was time to cash in and take the offer, a figure of which was never revealed. What was funny is that the USA Network actually sent out a press release like it was real, and several leading financial websites and a few entertainment sites ran a story from the press release like it was real. Most had taken it down by the end of Tuesday, but others raised the question of a public company not explaining in some form that this was storyline because it was getting reported in legit circles as real. Trump started insulting McMahon in the tape and played the same babyface role against McMahon he played before. Trump comes off like a wrestling character, so he didn't seem out of place. One would assume this is to lead to Vince creating his own competition in angle form, with a Raw vs. SmackDown feud. The question is exactly what it took to get Trump involved and what it will take to keep him involved. Trump's similar role in Affliction was in exchange for an equity stake in the company, something that isn't going to happen here. The positive is he is a celebrity and it'll get more coverage for WWE, although at some point the novelty will wear out, both with the press, and probably himself. All that was made clear is Trump will be appearing live on the June 22 show in Green Bay, where McMahon will say goodbye. I can't imagine him making too many live appearances. Trump's first announcement was that the June 22 Raw would be commercial-free. In actuality, the USA Network had been in talks for an experimental commercial-free Raw for a few weeks. Part of the reason is to see what not having commercials will do for the rating, since a significant percentage of Raw viewers look elsewhere during commercial breaks. Perhaps it's a hot shot because Raw has not been winning its time slot on cable of late, and with the closer going head-to-head, it wasn't likely to until that show's season ends. Raw has a pretty significant variation during the show when it comes to viewership based on some people knowing to watch the 10 p.m. segment and to tune in at 11 p.m. and you'll see the two key parts of the show, as well as based on who is on the screen. USA pays WWE about $550,000 per week for rights fees to Raw, and in exchange, the idea is USA makes its money back selling the commercial time, so they are losing $550,000 plus whatever additional expenses they incur under the contract that week. It's their version of a promotional gimmick like McMahon's Millions, with the idea of garnering publicity which in turn will jumpstart the ratings. The thing is, between the 3-hour show on June 15th, and then to make the June 22nd thing mean something, they will have to market that heavily as something special. That really leaves the June 28th Mystery Bash pay-per-view suffering from a lack of build. In fact, at the end of the June 15th Raw, only 2 matches were made clear for the pay-per-view, a tag title match with Carlito and Primo Colon defending against Ted DiBiase and Cody Rhodes, which means nothing on pay-per-view, and CM Punk vs. Jeff Hardy for the world title. 2 other matches confirmed for the show are Randy Orton vs. Triple H for the WWE title, which may have been announced by Trump, but if it was so confusing nobody would have gotten it, and it was never mentioned on the ECW show. So if it's not mentioned on SmackDown, and my gut is they won't because they don't want to confuse people on 2 Triple H vs. Orton title matches 6 days apart, it won't be plugged until Raw, meaning a 6-day build. Rey Mysterio putting up his mask against Chris Jericho will be announced on June 19th, or having a 9-day build. They are setting up Tommy Dreamer vs. Jack Swagger for the ECW title, but it's not confirmed if it's a TV match or a pay-per-view match. On the show, after Orton had won the 4-way to take the title vacated when Batista won the title and then did the injury angle to set up his bicep surgery, they did a battle royal for the title shot at the Bash. Triple H won the battle royal, and Trump, in a pre-tape, said that they weren't going to wait until the pay-per-view, but that the title match would take place next week on Raw in a last man standing match. The idea right now is to do something out of that match, which marks the third last man standing match the two have had in recent years. Orton won on October 7, 2007, at No Mercy in a title match, and Triple H won on June 1, 2008, at One Night Stand, and Bring It Back. Likely with a different stip on pay-per-view. To show how plans are changing on the fly, there were radio interviews for upcoming house shows that started running in markets before the TV show aired, some of which listed Orton vs. Triple H at house shows with Orton defending, and some of which listed Cena vs. Show at house shows with Cena defending. Basically, that indicates during the week there were points when both Orton and Cena were going to win, strong enough to where they'd be sure enough to tape commercials. A funny story is that Ric Flair was backstage in Charlotte. Flair was brought in for the show specifically to be backstage and make people think he was going to be named general manager for the very idea of having it get out on the internet from the wrestlers. The Trump thing was kept from everyone except those involved in the pre-tape and maybe a few, as in very few, others. Overall, it was a strong show as the 4 title matches all delivered. The Trump thing failed in the building but was an effective publicity stunt. Then again, the last time people thought WWE did an effective publicity stunt, Denver debacle, it ended up making them look bad in the end. The 3-hour show, billed as the 3 for All, for a 3-hour show with all 3 brand titles at stake, basically pushed as a free pay-per-view show 1 week after a pay-per-view show and 2 weeks before the next one, did a 3.63 rating and 5.46 million viewers. The show did a 2.97 rating in men 18 to 49 with the average viewer being 36. The hours were 3.03, 3.75 and 4.10. 1. Chavo Guerrero pinned Santino Marella in a match taped for Superstars. 2. Chris Jericho retained the IC title pinning Rey Mysterio in 9:38. Jericho started with his usual promo, saying that since he left, Raw has gone to hell. Way too close to the truth here. He called the fans bulbous manatees. First big spot was Mysterio coming off the apron for a Thez press and Jericho caught him and dropped him with a hot shot-like maneuver on the announcer's table. Mysterio came back with a tope. He did the Atlanta spinning torture rack and then a rack drop. Basically the same type of match as they had on pay-per-view last week, but shorter, with lots of near falls. Mysterio did a Hurricane Rana into a 619. He went for a springboard move but Jericho grabbed his mask and twisted it so Mysterio couldn't see, then dropped him into a codebreaker for the pin. 3 stars half. Randy Orton cut a promo and John Cena came out, pretending to be Josh Matthews and doing a spoof on an interviewer making a remark about Orton's Baby Oil Boys Club. 3. Tommy Dreamer pinned Christian in 3:24 to keep the ECW title. No reaction at all when Dreamer came out. Christian they see as a star. This was where trying to be innovative was plain stupid and killed the match. They wanted to do the SportsCenter deal where they say it's so many minutes until the next story. Since there is no such thing as time limits in WWE, no, to Southern Wrestling, even though boxing, MMA and the NFL in 2009 allow the sport to have time limits and the announcers are allowed to mention the referee's name as well, Matt Stryker said this match was one fall to a positive finish, or essentially no time limit. Then and he screened countdown to the WWE title match. About 90 seconds into this match, they said it was starting in 10 minutes. Basically they told you this match meant nothing and would be over quickly. Christian did a Silver King plancha. Christian sold his knee escaping a move and Dreamer used a small package for the pin. Half 1 star. 4. Randy Orton won a 4-way over John Cena, Triple H and Big Show to win the vacant WWE title in 11:12. Good match with lots of near falls. Show at one point splashed Cena, threw out Orton and speared Triple H for a near fall. Show missed an elbow drop off the middle rope and Orton went for the RKO, but Show threw him off. The finish saw Triple H hit Show with a pedigree, but he kicked out. Cena used the attitude adjustment on Show, but Orton saved. Orton then used an RKO on Show for the pin. 3 stars half. Vince made the announcement of Donald Trump as the owner of Raw. The crowd didn't react nearly as much to Vince as usual and the people groaned at Trump on tape as if they weren't buying it. The crowd was super hot for Flair all night since they were in Charlotte, and even though word got out he was backstage, he never came out, even during a commercial break. Trump, since he's not going to be there weekly, would likely appoint a general manager. It could be Flair, although there are circumstances that lead me to believe it won't be. Basically, Flair has not signed a contract with WWE and there are reasons that it now looks like WWE is not going to sign him to a contract, however they're going to use him as a non-contracted television performer, and don't want him doing anybody else's television. Vince also announced the main event on TV would be a battle royal for the title shot at the Bash. 5. Mickie James pinned Rosa Mendes in 2:48 with a DDT. Maryse was at ringside. She continued to do a great job. Storyline continued that Maryse is avoiding giving James a title match. Terrible match. Mendes has noticeably dropped weight in recent weeks, but in doing so looks more frail. They have her coming out to Latin music and in developmental push that she is from Costa Rica. She is part Costa Rican, for an ethnic gimmick to be a star in the Central and South American market. Now when she's on the big stage, she's from San Mateo, California. She has great talent as far as presence and mic work. In a sidekick role, has to be aligned with someone who can carry a promo and give her short spots. But she's simply not a wrestler. Miz did a promo. Before he came out, Goldust and Hornswoggle were using the t-shirt gun to shoot t-shirts into the crowd. They were still in the ring, and mid-promo, he noticed them and arrogantly told them both to leave. Goldust confronted him. Miz made the remark that this isn't giving Ahmed Johnson mouth-to-mouth, in reference to an angle something like 13 years ago. Talk about zero reaction. TNA and WWE both this week made reference to minor angles from years back, and in both cases it was stuff virtually nobody remembers. Yeah, huge stuff people remember, but I'd bet 85% of the viewers and people in the stands wouldn't even remember Ahmed Johnson, let alone that angle. Miz said it's not 1999. It's 2009 and he hasn't even been relevant for a decade. I'm not sure Goldust was relevant in 1999. Even though Goldust did a good job with facials and mic work, he's been treated like dirt since his return, and nobody cared when Miz laid him out with a DDT. How many people are now using DDTs as their finishes? He then confronted Hornswoggle and grabbed the t-shirt gun. He teased not shooting it, but did, and nailed Hornswoggle with a t-shirt to the stomach. Hornswoggle sold it like it must have been a loaded t-shirt. The people did care about him, and that got heat. CM Punk did a promo. He had Misawa written on the tape on his wrist and forearms. During his match later, he also did some Misawa standing hard elbow series as a tribute. He is starting what appears to be a heel turn, saying that last year he saw an opportunity after Batista laid out Edge and cashed him Money in the Bank. Everyone cheered and nobody questioned him. He said this year he saw the same opportunity. He said he decided that no matter who won, he was cashing it in after the ladder match, but now a vocal minority weren't happy with it. Matt Hardy came out to congratulate him, saying he'd have done the same thing. Punk then, in his "I haven't turned heel yet" spot, told off Hardy, saying that Hardy isn't him because Hardy has never won a world title. They buried the ECW title again on this show. 6. CM Punk kept the world title over Edge and Jeff Hardy in 1537. Punk got a mixed reaction. He hit Edge with a tope, and he may have been trying the Misawa elbow suicida. Jeff followed with a plancha on Punk. Punk tried a GTS on Hardy, but Edge used a chop block on Punk to break it up. Turned into a real good match with the usual near falls and saves. After Punk was thrown out, Hardy used a twist of fate and swanton on Edge. Punk made the save and threw Hardy into the steps and the pinned Edge. 3 3/4 stars. Teddy Long then announced Punk vs Hardy for the title at the Bash. 7. Carlito and Primo won a non-title match over David Hart Smith and Tyson Kidd in 2:23. It opened with Primo and Smith totally botching a Primo Hurricane Rana spot, and Primo nearly got hurt on how he was dropped. Crowd wasn't into this and they didn't have time to get them back. This was mainly just a showcase to give Ted DiBiase and Cody Rhodes mic time build the tag title match on the Bash. Carlito used the backstabber on Smith, when Rhodes and DiBiase interfered for the DQ. Vince and Santino Marella did comedy in Vince's office. Marella wanted to kiss up to Trump so he could keep his job. He made references to understand with Vince now being 70, and then started lowering the age when Vince got mad. Vince was mad at Trump tongue-lashing him earlier in the show, saying how he hates arrogant rich people, and Marella whispered how he must hate himself. 8. Triple H won a 10-man battle royal to get the title shot in 1738. A lot better than most battle royals. The early part was show dominating everyone and throwing out Matt Hardy right away, and then MVP. I could see getting Matt out fast, but MVP has become the latest in the start and stop club, and this pretty much told fans not to invest in him past mid-card. Then everyone left all ganged up and threw out show. There were no eliminations for a long time. DiBiase and Rhodes during the prior match while on the mic said their role was to make sure certain people didn't win. They failed. It was a long time before the next elimination, which was DiBiase and Rhodes throwing out Kofi Kingston, and then William Regal. They tried to eliminate Triple H and Cena, but instead, Cena threw out DiBiase and Triple H threw out Rhodes. This left Triple H and Cena to battle it out, and people were into it and didn't boo either guy. DiBiase and Rhodes both got back in the ring and attacked both guys, beating them down. Earlier in the match, Show had choke-slammed Miz, and he rolled under the bottom rope and had never been heard from again. Everyone had forgotten about him by this point, and he came from under the ring. This finish went from great to mind-boggling in seconds. With Triple H and Cena near the ropes, Miz made a running charge after manipulating the rules to stay alive. They separated and pulled down the ropes, and Miz ran like a maniac and flew over the top, eliminating himself. This was the 3-second rendition on why it's so difficult to get over. Because even when you get yourself over, they make sure within weeks to make it clear you're not a top guy. Miz came off like this quarter Santino Marella heel comedy's second match act. Triple H then threw Cena out to win. How hard would it have been for Miz to have snuck in and eliminated Cena, who wasn't looking and didn't know he was still alive, and then Triple H eliminate Miz to win? It keeps Miz vs. Cena alive, with Miz bragging about eliminating Cena and Cena having a reason to now care about him. Plus, Triple H doesn't have to throw out Cena one-on-one, not establishing that Cena is not the top babyface anymore, leaving question as to who would have won without Miz screwing it up builds for stuff down the line. Trump then announced that he didn't want to wait for the bash, and the title match would be next week on TV in a last man standing match. In what had to be the ultimate embarrassment for MMA, two-time UFC heavyweight champion Tim Sylvia was knocked out in 10 seconds by 48-year-old Ray Mercer on June 13 in Birmingham in an MMA match. Mercer, whose official MMA record was 0-0, he actually had lost a match quickly to Kimbo Slice on June 23, 2007, in a match the New Jersey State Athletic Board refused to sanction, but allowed it to go on as an exhibition, countered a weak kick by Sylvia, putting him down with a right hand, and Sylvia did a slow-motion fall to the ground like a big tree that had just been sawed. Mercer threw 2 more punches on the ground and it was stopped. It took the 33-year-old Sylvia several minutes to get to his feet after the beating, while Mercer issued a challenge to Butterbean, who is from Jasper, Alabama. Mercer stopped Sylvia under MMA rules significantly quicker than Fedor Emelianenko did, let alone Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira and Randy Couture, giving boxing people a piece of genuine ammunition to dismiss the fighting talent of MMA fighters. The reality is, there is a rule of thumb in a sport where you allow punching and that there is always the puncher's chance. The odds are against it, but it can still happen. You can point to endless matches with boxers against grapplers historically, and usually they end with a grappler getting the takedown and winning, but a great punch at the right time, Matt Serra vs. Georges St. Pierre, can overcome all kinds of physical superiority, just like a recreational golfer can get a hole-in-one every now and then. And in MMA, anything can happen, and results of fights are never absolute judgments over who is the better fighter. They are only about who won that specific fight. The match was originally scheduled as a boxing match, but on June 11th, the Association of Boxing Commissions under the Muhammad Ali Act got the match shut down. The match was originally to take place in New Jersey as a planned boxing match. The commission there refused to sanction Sylvia, who had never boxed professionally, to take on the 1988 Olympic gold medalist and former WBO heavyweight champion, holding the title for most of 1991 before vacating it, who at present is ranked number 37 in the heavyweight division among U.S. heavyweights. Promoter Monty Cox moved the fight to Birmingham, Alabama, which doesn't have an athletic commission in place. Legislation was passed to regulate boxing with a commission in the state, but the law hasn't been enacted. Because boxing is illegal in the U.S. if not sanctioned by a commission, unlike MMA, which doesn't fall under the same federal law, the Cox brought in a representative of the River Creek Combative Sports Commission, which governs fights at the River Creek Casino just outside of Edmonton. Tim Lukenhoff, the head of the commission in Missouri and president of the ABC, said there was no federal law to stop the fight as an MMA fight, but they did have the power to stop it as a boxing match because legally it had to be sanctioned by an athletic commission in the U.S. in addition. Cox's plan of having them fight under boxing rules in a cage was against federal laws regulating pro boxing, where it has to be in a ring, as part of the 1996 Professional Boxing Safety Act passed by Congress. Greg Syerb, who heads the Pennsylvania Commission, told both the commission and John McCarthy, who was scheduled to referee and is not a licensed pro boxing referee, that both were violating the laws and both pulled out of the event. With the event about to be closed down, in order to get his payday, Mercer agreed to fight Sylvia under MMA rules later that day. Mercer had asked Sylvia for a gentleman's agreement to actually keep it as a boxing match, although with MMA rules they would be using the smaller gloves. Sylvia turned down the agreement, and under the rules, it appeared Mercer would get slaughtered. But that didn't happen. Mercer, who went undefeated in his first 19 fights until losing via decision to an aging Larry Holmes in 1992, had also lost to Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield via decision. His first major title fight since vacating the WBO belt wasn't until the age of 41, when he was stopped in 6 rounds by Vladimir Klitschko in a WBO title match. At 256 pounds, he was 28 pounds heavier than in that fight. Mercer was at one point scheduled for a boxer versus wrestler match under modified Ali/Inoki rules against Kazuyuki Fujita on a New Year's Eve show, but backed out at the last minute. He also fought in K1 in 2004 and 2005, losing once via decision to Musashi and quitting in seconds after a head kick by Remy Bonjasky. Sylvia, 24-6, was generally ranked roughly number 10 in the world in most MMA heavyweight world ratings, weighed in at a whopping 310.6 pounds, 48 pounds more than in his loss to Couture, and looking way out of shape. The loss was even more costly for Sylvia, since the general reaction is that he embarrassed the entire profession showing up out of shape and losing in that matter under MMA rules. Sylvia was scheduled to face Paul Buntello on the August 1st Affliction pay-per-view show in Anaheim, but Affliction pulled Sylvia, whose contract with the promotion was for $800,000 per fight plus a $200,000 win bonus, from the show. They announced Buntello would face a new opponent, possibly the winner of a June 27th fight in Biloxi on pay-per-view with Pedro Rizzo versus Gilbert Eval, which is the co-feature on the Bob Sapp vs. Bobby Lashley show. That big offer led to Sylvia being happy to leave UFC, securing a mutual release, even though he had a fight left on his contract. In his first match after leaving the organization, Fedor Emelianenko knocked Sylvia down immediately and choked him out in 36 seconds to become the first WAMA heavyweight champion. Sylvia's 2 most recent MMA matches were losses. On February 2, 2008, in the main event position on the Brock Lesnar vs. Frank Mir show in Las Vegas, he lost via submission to Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, in a match Sylvia dominated until being caught on the ground at 1:28 of the 3rd round, to determine the interim UFC heavyweight champion after Couture left the company. Sylvia had 1 fight remaining on his UFC contract. UFC had decided against signing him to a new deal, upon getting wind of the money Affliction was throwing around, asked if he could be released from the contract earlier and it was granted. Sylvia, whose UFC contract was for $100,000 to show and a $100,000 win bonus, numbers he complained about because he felt it was unfair that fighters who were bigger drawing cards than he was, Ken Shamrock and Brock Lesnar in particular, were being paid more than he was, never grasping the economic realities of the sport. He was never popular or a drawing card even though he had 2 title reigns. He first won the title on February 28, 2003, beating Rico Rodriguez via TKO in 3:09. He was stripped of the title after a September 26, 2003, knockout win in 154 over Giant Gon McGee for testing positive for steroids. His second title win came via TKO, beating Andrei Arlovsky in 2:43 on April 15, 2006, losing to Couture on March 3, 2007, in Columbus, Ohio by 5-round decision in one of UFC's all-time most well-remembered fights. Mirko Cro Cop's return to UFC was over before it started. After talking at length about how he was back to get the UFC Heavyweight Championship, and that his match on June 13 in Cologne. In a story that was strange, but hardly unexpected, it took Dana White and Cro Cop only a few phone calls after exchanging text messages to verbally reach a deal. For Cro Cop, it was a chance to perform near Croatia, where he is a national sports hero. For UFC, it was a way to boost ticket sales, not to mention bring back Cro Cop after the memory of his losses to Gabriel Gonzaga and Czech Congo 2 years ago had faded. But after White first confirmed Cro Cop's return, it took 2 weeks to finalize the deal due to one problem after another. UFC wanted Cro Cop to face Cain Velasquez at first. He said no to that. He agreed to face Mostafa Al-Turk, a British fighter with a 6-3 record who was only on the roster because they were having trouble finding an opponent for Velasquez. He never fought Velasquez, as that fight fell through, and instead he lost to Congo in his debut. Al-Turk suddenly talked of being injured when his opponent changed from Todd Duffy to Cro Cop, and then negotiations with Cro Cop weren't going smoothly, as UFC wanted him to sign a long-term deal. His management talked like they would, but somehow it didn't happen. Because it was less than 2 weeks before the show and time was running out on being able to announce it and have his name mean anything, they signed a 1-fight deal with the promise that the minor issues would be worked through and he'd sign the multiple fight contract when they all met in Germany before the fight. On June 9, Cro Cop and White were together for a press conference, where White wouldn't acknowledge it was a 1-fight deal, only that he had made a deal on the phone and it was a different kind of deal than he'd ever done before in the history of the company. But White and Crow Cop both assured reporters that he was in for good and ready to face the UFC's top heavyweights. Late on June 12, White got the word that in Japan a story had broken where Crow Cop's agent Ken Imai said they had agreed to a 3-fight deal with Dream where Crow Cop would return on the July 20th show, and also work in September, with the final fight being on New Year's Eve. Dream's hope is for 2 Crow Cop wins, and to build for a Crow Cop vs. Fedor Emelianenko fight on New Year's Eve, but a lot can happen between now and then. The next day, when all of a sudden there were excuses on why they weren't signing the long-term contract, he knew he'd been had. It could be played for sympathy, but there are no virgins in this game and there are enough horror stories about negotiations with certain people that there is no excuse for naivete. When Crow Cop didn't show up at the post-fight press conference, White unleashed a verbal barrage on him. "Isn't that a dirty fucking thing to do?" White said when asked if Crow Cop had signed with Dream. "He fucked me the first time in the history of the company I do one over the phone. He didn't keep his word. He talked about honor and all this other shit and he fucked me. He fed me this bullshit about wanting to take a run for the title, and what I think he did was, he went out and did this. He turned down every other fucking fighter I offered him, because I needed him to fight Kane, after Heath Herring pulled out of the fight 3 weeks earlier citing an illness that didn't allow him to train properly. He didn't just poke Al Turk, he poked me too." Crow Cop, after hearing all this, the next day, claimed he had not signed with Dream, couldn't understand why White would say those things based on rumors, and that he should have first talked with him directly, saying that he still wanted to fight in UFC. "My gut says they were playing both sides. The key was telling both sides they had a long-term deal and having both sides go public with it before the fight took place. If by some small chance he'd have lost to Al Turk, he'd still be able to go to Dream for top money, because Crow Cop is a star in Japan and the fan base there doesn't care much about wins and losses, particularly of a fight outside the country. If he won, he's in the catbird seat. Dream already announced they had him, so they wouldn't want to look bad and would up a bit if necessary if they thought he might go to UFC. UFC already announced they had him, so they also wouldn't want to look bad, like there's an organization bigger than them. In the end, he likes to get a better financial deal and more bargaining leverage, whether it be to pick fights, or whatever he'd want. He all but admitted that on June 16th, saying, "I haven't signed nothing yet with any organization, and as I said, I'm preparing to talk to both sides. I've never been in a sweeter yet more difficult position." But UFC took it as a slap in the face. Within UFC the word is that he probably will never fight for the company again, although Crow Cop has said if he does sign with Dream, he'd like to return to UFC when that contract is over. Dream officials claim he has signed a 3-fight deal with them, and UFC officials said they were told before the fight went on that Crow Cop had signed a multi-fight deal with Dream. Crow Cop on June 16th was still denying it, and may not be lying in the sense of pen to paper, but I think it's pretty obvious they made verbal deals with both sides prior to the fight. "I have nothing to hide or be ashamed of," Crow Cop said in an interview in Croatia. "The thing is very simple. I know the truth and Dana knows the truth. I had a 1-fight deal with UFC, and I fulfilled my contractual obligation. I said we're gonna sit down and talk after UFC 99. He claimed UFC wasn't going to offer him another fight for 6 months and he wanted to fight more often, and Dream offered him 3 more fights this year. He said he still wants the UFC title and that UFC has the best talent, but he wants to fight more often. The thing with UFC is that they are booked solid through UFC 102 at the end of August, but are scrambling for a main event for September, and I don't believe that if he asks to fight in September they aren't going to open for that possibility. While he's not a big name in the US, he is a heavyweight knockout highlight reel guy, and guys like that are easy to sell." Crow Cop, coming off knee surgery on January 13th, showing up at 233 pounds, the exact weight he predicted, was significantly bigger than he was the last time in UFC. In particular, he had his tree trunk legs he had in Japan, and thick shoulders and back. He was bigger, more powerful looking, and heavier than he had ever looked in a fight. He was able to throw Al Turk, a wrestler, off him with ease, with power he didn't have the last time he was in UFC. But he also looked slower and was flat-footed, and didn't look like the Crow Cop of old. But he didn't need to be against Al Turk. He shrugged off every Al Turk attempt at clinching, and basically walked him down. He showed Al Turk no respect, taking his shots like they were nothing, and finally unloading and decking Al Turk. He let him back up, largely to finish him, and seemed in the process of doing so when he poked his finger in Al Turk's eye. Al Turk turned his back and Crow Cop was unloading on him. It was bad officiating by Dan Miragliotta, It's not so bad that he missed the eye poke because on camera watching, nobody caught it until a slow motion replay. Al Turk should have screamed he was poked in the eye when he turned his back, but he didn't. It appeared Al Turk had quit, but Miragliotta didn't stop it until several punches later. Al Turk is now protesting the results. Based is not going to get anywhere. Whether right or wrong, and I strongly believe this is wrong, the unified rules that UFC goes under and uses even in a case of an overseas event where they regulate themselves, does not allow for instant replays to be used to overturn referees' decisions. Mark Ratner of UFC, who would have headed the regulation of this fight, noted he would talk to the Association of Boxing Commissions about getting a rule put in place. It was the same problem in Nevada last year in the Kevin Burns vs. Anthony Johnson fight, when Johnson went down after an eye poke so bad that he needed surgery to repair the damage, but ref Steve Mazzagatti missed it and Burns was ruled the winner via TKO. Mazzagatti himself admitted after watching a tape that he made the wrong call, but he didn't have the power to overturn his own decision. Johnson protested, and while Keith Kaiser noted that it was unfortunate that the state didn't have bylaws in place to overturn the decision and you can't make what would even be the right ruling when the rules don't allow for it, he did say that it would be good if that fight causes rules to be put into effect that allow for use of replays, at least when it comes to the actual disputed finish of a fight. He said he wouldn't be in favor of a replay for an illegal move that didn't directly lead to an immediate finish because while it could have changed the fight, it wouldn't have been the outcome itself. But thus far, those rules are not in place. New Jersey does have a rule in place where replays can be used in examining finishes. There is also a note on consistency of rules, because many MMA shows aren't televised, but to me, that's the breaks. If there is the capacity in the arena to look back and see a wrong decision was made, the commission or referee should be able to overturn it. In this case, because you have to go by the assumption the eye poke wasn't intentional, although it was strange that when you aim your fist at someone's eye that your hand is open and not closed at the point of connection, so it should be a no contest. UFC 99 was a decent show, that looked great on paper but fell a little short of the mark. The card drew 12,854 fans and just under $1.3 million at the Lanxess Arena in a city where the event was hugely controversial in the media. Very early estimates indicate it will be the most successful UFC pay-per-view event broadcast live from Europe, but will fall short of most of the pre-event estimates we've been hearing. It's way too early for a number, but right now it looks very slightly above the January 17th show headlined by Rich Franklin vs. Dan Henderson, the record for a European show, which doesn't do as well because it airs at noon on the West Coast, and there are hours to get the results as opposed to ordering the prime time airing that the majority of people who are going to get together in groups will watch. It looks at this point slightly below the March 7 show headlined by Quinton Jackson vs. Keith Jardine, so I guess that would put it between 320,000 and 350,000. How's that for saying it's too early for a number? The two biggest stars at the live event were Cro Cop, by far, followed by Vanderlei Silva. While Silva did not look like the Silva of old, nor will he ever, he fought a competitive fight against a very good fighter. He didn't look shot, took plenty of good shots, and never went down. After his knockout against Jackson on December 27, there was fear he was done. Now, losing 5 of 6 isn't a great record, but all 6 fights were against quality guys. He's trying to remake himself as someone who goes out to entertain the fans and have great fights and isn't concerned so much with winning and losing. That's a code word for a guy who knows he's no longer at his best, but figures if he makes himself popular enough, he'll be able to stick around even with losses. During the match with Franklin, he did on a few occasions stop and play to the crowd like a pro wrestler trying to work the crowd, which got him a huge pop and built heat, but wasn't the smartest thing to do in a close fight. After the fight, he did the broken English version of the Jens Pulver promo, and it was pretty effective. The match showed there was no reason for him to be retired just yet. The other big question mark, Cain Velasquez, won handily over Czech Congo and was impressive in some aspects, but overall his status as the more feared heavyweight took a beating. Velasquez got rocked every time he was standing. His punch defense looked non-existent. While on top on the ground, he didn't appear to have big punching power, certainly not when compared with Brock Lesnar, Fedor Emelianenko or Shane Carwin. The win wasn't that much different from Lesnar versus Heath Herring, other than Velasquez got hurt every time he was standing and Lesnar never got hurt, and Velasquez can throw punches all day without having to worry about getting tired. He didn't try any submissions. His positives are that he can take a great shot, but if he takes too many, that won't last. His takedown ability is very good and his technical wrestling is excellent for a heavyweight. He also has top-notch conditioning. But the story of the fight is he was able to always get the fight to the ground, and he was relentless in punching from the top. But he was like a Nick Diaz, throwing one shot after another, but the shots don't have a lot of power. While his next opponent hasn't been decided, Shane Carwin is a good possibility, with a winner in line for a title shot. 1. John Hathaway, 11-0, won a unanimous decision over Rick Story, 7-3, on scores of 29-28, 30-27 and 29-28. 2. Stefan Strove, 17-3, beat Dennis Stogenick, 5-3, in a heavyweight battle via choke at 2:37 of the second round. Strove is the near 7-foot-tall submission master. Stogenick hurt him bad and Strove bled a ridiculous amount, from a cut between the eyes. It was ridiculously bloody, but the doctor ruled it was not dangerous and kept the fight going. It made for a dramatic fight, but with all the bad press in Germany, the negative reporters looking for a story got it. In fact, there were reporters that left after this match. As it turned, Strove got the takedown, bled all over Stogenick, got his back and finished him with a choke. 3. Paul Kelly, 9-1, beat Rolly Delgado, 6-4-1, after 3 rounds via unanimous decision with scores of 29-28 across the board. 4. Paul Taylor, 10-4-1, beat Peter Sobotta, 8-2, after 3 rounds via decision on scores of 30-27 across the board. 5. Dennis Siver, 14-6, beat Dale Hart, 6-2, via choke at 3:23. 6. Terry Edom, 13-2, beat Justin Buchholz, 8-3, via Darce choke at 2:38 of the second round. Said to be a great fight as Edom was getting pounded on early, and came back to win with an impressive submission. Edom got a $60,000 best submission bonus,